Natalie Rogers, and I'm here on behalf of the Arkansas Floodplain Management Association. I serve as our current past chairman, as well as our professional development and CFM coordinator. And so today I'm going to give y'all a little refresher on all things flood zones and talk a little bit about flood insurance and how that impacts you as a realtor. So just real quickly, show of hands, how many of you here are familiar if I say FEMA firm map? Everybody know what that is? All right. If I told you that FEMA has a special flood hazard area, would you know what that is, just by show of hands? All right, so I just kind of wanted to gauge where we're at. I will try my best not to use any acronyms. I apologize. Stop me if something is confusing or you have questions. I want this to be a little bit of back and forth, so I'm happy to answer any questions as we're going along. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about. So let me see if I can get this to go to the next slide. Our agenda, we're going to do just some quick, fast facts and some common misconceptions about FEMA's floodplains and their firm maps. We're going to talk a little bit about those flood insurance rate maps, or the firm. And then really we're going to hit on why is this important, why is it important to you as a realtor. So, the goals. We want to educate you about floodplains. I am not here to get into the nitty-gritty weeds of how these firm maps are developed, but I want to hit the really key important parts to you so that you can provide that knowledge to your clients as well, and that's going to strengthen your customer service as a realtor. So they trust you to help you navigate, or to help them navigate, the exciting time of purchasing a home. And there are a lot of times where all of a sudden a house is in the floodplain, and so you need to have a basic understanding so that you can navigate that with your client and help them feel a little more at ease about that process. All right, so part one, we're going to talk about some flood facts. So a question here, how much water does it take to cause approximately $25,000 worth of structure damage? Is it a foot, an inch, 4 inches, or half a foot?
4 inches.
All right, we got 1
Say
inch.
half foot.
All right, you will be surprised. Most of you got this actually. It is only 1 inch of water in a structure can cause $25,000 worth of damage. Since 1978, insurance policyholders have received over $154 million in claim payments. And a lot of that is due to homes that are not flooded very much. And a lot of these structures, depending on where they're located, this is recurring payments. And so you sometimes have homes who just have the unfortunate luck of being next to a stream that is very flashy, and so you have these recurring loss and these severe repetitive loss structures. So it really doesn't take a lot of water in a house to cause substantial damage. All it has to do is start soaking up that drywall and going up. And if you have carpet, your flooring, your baseboards, so it really adds up really quickly. All right, so our next question was, in 2024, what was the cost of flood damages to homes and businesses nationwide? 8.8, 10, or 10.2 billion with a B? Any guesses?
10.2.
All right, y'all went really on the high side. It was actually only $8.8 billion. Now, 2024, if you remember, that was the year we had pretty catastrophic hurricane season in 2024. Not every flood damage is going to be caused by a hurricane or is on a coastal property, but those are a significant portion of that total loss damage. So, what is a flood? A flood is a natural disaster that occurs when water overflows onto normal dry land. These can happen quickly. It can be a slow-moving flood. If anybody remembers 2019, we had the Arkansas River flood. That flood was not caused by precipitation in our area, I should specify. There was precipitation way upstream, up in Kansas and Oklahoma, that all washed down into the Arkansas River, and so that flood was a very slow moving. It took days to get all the way to central Arkansas, so by the time that it got here, we were a little more prepared for it. So you have events like Sunday, we got a whole bunch of rain in an hour. So those are your flash flood events that can still cause a lot of damage because the intensity of the rainfall is so high. But you also have events that maybe are a little slow moving. Maybe it rains 3 or 4 inches over these couple of days, and then we get a dry spell and it rains another 3 or 4 inches. All of that water accumulates, and so then you start to see some more of that river flooding on some of those bigger streams. So it's not always very fast, and it's not always going to take days. It's a little bit of both. Like I said, this can be caused by heavy rainfall, overflow from rivers, or even depending on the area, the neighborhood, it can just be caused by poor drainage systems. We see a lot of systems today in older neighborhoods that maybe weren't designed to, they were designed to standards of their time. And we know that weather patterns are changing. We're getting very high frequency storms, so they maybe can't keep up to that. And so you see a lot of like flash flooding and localized just storm flooding, just because systems can't handle precipitation at times. So it's kind of goes a little bit back and forth there. So some other facts. These are some pictures that we've, as an organization, we try to track flooding systems. So these are some pictures that we've got here from Arkansas. But you know, when you're looking at a property, you really need to think of like everybody's in a flood zone. It may not be mapped, but unless you were on top of the hill, and even then sometimes, you know, everyone can be susceptible to flooding at some point. It may not be river flooding, it might be more localized drainage causing, but when you're looking at property, flood hazards is one of the highest causes of damages to homes. Like I said, you can have a flood event without rainfall, just like the 2019 Arkansas River event. It caused a lot of damage, in particular in Faulkner County, especially, and then when it moved through Little Rock in the Pine Bluff area because it was breaching levees. But again, those were not flooding events caused by any rainfall. And if we had had rainfall in any of our drainage systems that kind of immediately impact us, that would have been catastrophically worse. So those types of systems and those types of flooding can happen. Flooding can happen anywhere. It can happen close to a stream, away from a stream, and really it can happen any time of year. This rain that we've been getting in May this year has kind of felt like April storms last year and the year before. You know, we had that big rain event last April, the first week of April, and I don't know if anybody saw that great picture of somebody water skating on 57 there in Jacksonville. So, you know, but we've had flooding events in December. We've had flooding events all throughout the year. So yes, there are times when we have wet seasons, but flooding really, you know, one storm system is all it takes. Every homeowner and business owner and renter that participates is in a community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. If that home has a federally backed mortgage, they're going to need to purchase flood insurance. So we have many communities that don't participate in the NFIP, so in the state of Arkansas, but if the community does participate, that is what sets off that requirement to have the flood insurance. So that's where you're going to have those mapped zones. One common misconception is that they may not realize that their standard home insurance policy doesn't cover flood insurance. So just a normal standard home insurance policy is not going to cover flood damages. It might cover, you know, a water leak in your house, but that's not going to be the same as a flood damage claim. And so that's some of those things that you don't think about when you're getting your home insurance. If you have renter's insurance does not cover flood damages. So it's a completely separate policy that you have to get. And it can be purchased through either the federal flood insurance program or through private insurers. So, one of the big misconceptions, and this is one of the things that we hear a lot, the FEMA firm map, their special flood hazard layer, is mapped to a 100-year event. And a lot of people, and it's just the way it's worded. They think it's a 100-year event, so it can only happen once in 100 years. But what that really means is actually a percent chance. So that 100-year event has a 1% chance to occur every year. And so you really kind of have to think about it as like a bag of marbles. You may have a bag of marbles with a bunch of red ones mixed in with all these other colors. you have a 1% chance of pulling out that red marble. So it's kind of just back to your statistics. But with that 1% chance, over the life of a 30-year mortgage, there's a 26% chance that that house is going to flood during that 30 years. And so that's where it becomes really important is, yeah, you may think that's not very high percent, but if they do live near a stream, for instance, that might happen more than that 26%. But that is the average across that 30-year mortgage. So some other misconceptions. A lot of people think that these firm maps, so this is actually a snapshot of a special flood hazard area, and we'll talk about all the zones in some upcoming slides. But a lot of people, you know, it's just a common misconception that these maps are great. They're perfect. The federal government did it. They're awesome. That is not always the case. A lot of these firm maps are very old. And in Arkansas in particular, a lot of these maps are very old. It is not uncommon, it's getting better, but there are still places in Arkansas that don't have digital maps, so they don't have these nice pretty colored maps that you can look at online. You only have the old black and white paper maps. And there are still places in Arkansas that haven't been restudied or remapped since the 80s and 90s. That is getting to be a more of a rare occurrence, but there are still locations where you have pretty outdated data. And so it doesn't mean necessarily that it's bad, it just means that it hasn't been updated or looked at again in a long time. And so also what happens with that is when they're doing these studies, they're normally looking at studies on a stream basis, a community basis, or a countywide basis. And so you see here at the Pulaski and Lonoke County line, you have a mismatch. Now, they are taking steps to remedy that in a lot of these new studies, and so that you won't see as much of this, because you can see you have this streamline that continues on. So, you know, newer maps today are starting to remedy that so that it has a better smooth tie-in between these municipal boundaries, because we know water is not just going to stop when it hits this roadway and goes into Pulaski County or vice versa. That's not how water moves. And so you have to just kind of be aware that this map is what you have to work with, but there are some remedies to that as well that we'll talk about and how you can address some of these mismatches. But I do want to say, you know, when they do these studies, they take a long time. It's many years to do the whole study, survey, you got to do all the engineering, you got to update the mapping. Then it goes through a community review process and appeal. So this is not this doesn't get done in a year. This gets done in 5 years, you know, at best. And so it's a long process. So when these studies are done and when these maps are created, they're really a snapshot in time based on the methods that were the appropriate methods at the time of that study. And so some of these studies from the 80s and 90s, again, they're not bad, but there's newer technology, there's newer methods to study these, and we have things like better LiDAR data that we can do this with. And so there's a lot more newer things that help make them more accurate when they do new studies. Here, this is kind of another, just a snapshot of where some of these maps, you can tell it's an older map. You have a lake, and suddenly your mapping just stops in the middle of the lake. And so you'll see that from time to time, of just where mapping doesn't quite match up with the underlying ground terrain or the underlying aerial imagery, and that's just simply due to it was mapped using really broad methods, approximate methods, and using like a USGS map, which just doesn't give you very detailed ground information. Another misconception is that if my house is not mapped, I am safe, and that's not always the case. Like I said, there are a lot of times where flood claims happen outside of these mapped areas. So in Texas is a great example with Hurricane Harvey. A lot of the home damages during Hurricane Harvey were well outside the 100-year floodplain. And so Texas has actually raised all of their standards to everything has to be mapped to the 500-year event. So it means means there's a 0.2% chance of that occurring on any year. And they fully regulate to that. And so development has to go through that whole permitting process, even for that slightly lower chance event, because so many homes were damaged outside of this mapped blue area. So just because you are outside of it doesn't mean you're completely safe. And if someone like here decided to get home flood insurance, it would be significantly cheaper for them as a homeowner because they are outside of that mapped area, but it protects them in the long run. It helps in the event that there is some type of catastrophic flood that would be larger and wider than that event. So, in summary, everyone is susceptible to flooding. Any structure, any home can have some type of flood damages. And so, just kind of reiterating that 2024 alone, $8.8 billion of flood damage. Just flood damage across the United States. That's huge, and it's only going up. And so, as realtors, you can't solve all of these problems, but you can help provide that information to your homeowners, to your buyers, your sellers, so that they are educated the best way that they can be. So, before we go to part 2, any questions? All right.
This may be
Yes.
something that you're going to address later, but the question rose in my mind as to the insurance companies. What do they rely on? Certainly, they have more access than the maps that we have online access to, I assume.
They have those same maps. Where they have a little bit more information is, and we'll look at the different zones. There's specific zones that are less detailed, so they can have a little bit more information on their side of things for those areas with regards to like what they're establishing as like the base flood elevation. But with the areas that are, the areas like this that are the really detailed areas, they're gonna have the same information you have, so.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, so we're going to talk about firm maps. So that's your flood insurance rate map. And just a quick fact, I'm actually blocking that. There are 424 Arkansas communities who participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And when I say communities, that includes incorporated communities as well as the unincorporated county areas. So that is all lumped in together. So if a house is in the county, if the county participates in the NFIP, then that's part of that community as well. So when you see a flood insurance rate map or a firm, what they do is that they're there to identify what are the flood regulations. So they're going to be the maps that define that floodplain. It's going to give you that flood insurance rating, whether a house is in a low, moderate, or high risk area. These are also used for emergency planning, so all of your county and city officials, they have access to all of these maps. They use these maps for their planning purposes, emergency response, if there's a flash flooding event, things like that. But what they really do is they identify what's that high, moderate, and low risk. And I'm showing 2 here for a reason. So the key things you want to look at, every map is going to have a panel number to it, so you're not going to have just one giant map of a county and expect to try to get to that little bitty spot. So they're going to be broken up into panels. So there's going to be a panel number. It's going to identify the community, and then down here at the bottom, that's just going to tell you the last time that map was revised. So really that's important, just to give you an idea of how new or old that data might be. And I will say, with these dates, they don't always restudy every stream when they do a remap. So some streams might be a little older, newer. It really depends on what the community wanted and what, the funding was available. And so I've got you 2 here to show. So this is the newer version of the map. So these are those nice color maps that you see online. Pretty much everything now getting published is going to look like this. but you may come across some of these that are older. This is from White County, and this is what they'll look like. So all of the same information, it just may look a little bit different. So this is a good graphic I like to show of like what the difference is between a digital map, which is here, full color, you have aerial underneath it, you can see the structures, it's very nice, versus the older paper maps that you'll see. So you can view these online, and there are a lot of counties that still have these, but it is a little bit harder to get that detail on these older black and white paper maps. But this is still what you have to work with in a lot of communities across the state. So it can make it a little more challenging to, you can zoom in, you can get all this information, but yeah, it can make it a little more challenging sometimes to get the information you need. So let's talk about our special flood hazard area and the different risks and the different zones that you're gonna see when you look at a map. So the first thing that we notice here, this area, you'll see here, if it says zone AB, that means it's a detailed study area. And anywhere that you see blue, that means it is a high-risk area. That is your 100-year, 1% floodplain. That's gonna cover everything you can see here from here to there. All of that blue area is your 100-year floodplain. All of that is your high-risk area. So if all of these houses are in that high-risk area. If there is this hatched area, this kind of orange hatching, that means that there is a floodway. And the floodway is the area of the highest risk. This is the area with the highest velocities, and it is meant to be an area to curb development, essentially. And so if you took this entire floodplain and you started to squeeze it in, squeeze it in, squeeze it in to a point where that water surface came up an entire foot, that is how they come up with this boundary. And so this is meant to be the highest risk location, and they really, communities try to not have development in those areas unless they have an engineering study that can show there's no changes to the water surface elevation. So there will be no increase in that water at the site of that development or further upstream from it. In this area here, this is called the flood fringe, and that's basically just to cover the rest of that floodplain area. So still a high risk, but that is the lower end of the high risk compared to the floodway. But this is in that high risk area.
And what do you say AE means that it's a detailed study?
Correct. So, and the next slide I'll show you what's the approximate study.
Okay.
This orange area here, and you'll see mapped up there at the top, that's gonna be your moderate risk area. So that's your 500-year floodplain, or the 0.2% chance of that occurring. So still a risk, but moderate risk areas are a little bit lower, and it changes some of the requirements there. All of this area outside the map, it is shown as being what's called Zone X minimal risk. And so if you looked at this on an actual like flood map, it's gonna show that area of minimal risk, Zone X, and that just goes back to what I talked about in part one, like everyone has some type of flood risk, but those are the areas with the lowest amount of risk. And so likely what you would see here, because of that, you might see more localized flooding type events, more of those stormwater type flooding events. Any questions before I go to the next one? All right, make sure I'm good on time. I do want to point out, so what will be really important for your clients with regards to their house is this base flood elevation. That is denoted by this kind of squiggly line there. That is the 100-year water surface elevation at that point. And so if a home is, we'll say a home was going in right here. If their home was like the first floor elevation of their home, the floor elevation, if it was at this 1182, then it would be at the base flood elevation. If it's lower than that, It's gonna be below your base flood elevation, which is gonna increase those insurance rates. If it is above it, it's gonna decrease those insurance rates, because it's lowering the risk by being up higher than that base flood elevation. In the areas that are denoted by zone AE, you will have base flood elevations throughout the entire of that mapped area. And in the next slide I'll show you, there are gonna be areas that don't have that elevation. So I will kind of talk you through how to get that. These are cross sections, and those are just another way from the engineering analysis. So those are gonna also show those elevations.
So if they build above that, a base flood elevation level, do they still have flood insurance?
Yes.
Okay.
If
Those
they
are
are,
the-
yeah, if they are still inside the mapped area,
Okay,
they still need to have it.
okay.
It can lower their rate. They're,
And the people in the low risk area, if they're above it, do they have flood insurance?
like in the orange area.
Yeah, and the known area.
Oh, yeah, if they're outside of it, no, that takes away the requirement completely.
If they're above that.
Well, either way,
Okay.
if they are not inside the blue area, there is no requirement. But like these houses, these would be a great case for strongly recommended to get home insurance. Not a requirement, it would be less, but it is strongly recommended.
It's to the.
When
Yeah.
It is to the left and right, how you determine above or below.
So this is where, so if we've got this elevation here of 1182, that's your ground elevation, or the water surface elevation. What they're gonna do is they need to look at if a new home is built. A surveyor and as-built plans is gonna show what's that bottom, like first floor elevation. So you walk in your house, what's that floor elevation? Is it higher or lower than that 1182?
So it's based on the survey, not necessarily.
Right, yeah.
Is it the survey or the specific flood elevations that the surveyor would shoot?
The surveyor would shoot the home elevations. The base flood elevation is going to be determined by the map, so.
So when the lender requires, or when the lender checks about flooding, do they use these maps or they request a certificate of elevation of property? What
So
do they do?
they're gonna first use this map to establish what that elevation is. They may or may not require an elevation certificate. That is, it kind of varies between lender. I actually just was helping my brother with this, a few weeks ago when he was buying a new house. His lender did not require one, but I advised him, like, it may be worthwhile to have a surveyor come out, get an elevation certificate so that you can show where your home is at compared to that, but it is not always required. But they're helpful. So, and we got a little slide to talk a little bit more about that too. Anything else?
So it's not, you can still build in the flood zone, but you have to build it above the flood
Yes.
elevation. So you see some house
Yeah.
on stilts and things like that.
Correct. And that's actually a really good point. Every community is different. So the base condition for the National Flood Insurance Program, so any community that is participating, their code has to say that any new construction or any, if, we'll just simplify it, as any new construction, it has to be built at least at this elevation. That can be placed by fill, it can be a crawl space, it can be on stilts. The first floor elevation has to be at that base flood elevation. Some communities will have what's called a freeboard, and so they'll have a higher standard, meaning it has to be 1 foot, 2 foot, in some cases 3 foot above that elevation. So, but the minimum is it has to be at that base flood elevation, so.
I have one more question,
Yeah.
sorry. We've seen several times that you have like part of the law, it's on the orange part and the other
Right.
part is not.
Yeah,
What would be that?
it depends on where the structure is the important part there, so if the structure is in the mapped area, that's the biggest part of that, of what's gonna trigger that. If it's the back part of the lot, like the backyard, you can usually show the, like the, as-built plans, or if like it's an older home and you can get a survey to show that, hey, this house is fully removed from
But
that.
you
method.
also said that the maps are not clear boundaries, so we saw properties that are on the X zone, but
Right.
the back of the lot is on the orange zone.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, then that's where it starts to get a little
sticky.
sticky. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Alright, let's talk about cross sections. Okay, so let's talk about these approximate studies. This is area that's gonna be classified as zone A. These are still high-risk areas, however, these studies are done with more approximate engineering analysis. And so if you see an area as a zone A, it is not going to have a floodway. So it's not gonna have any of that hatching area. That zone starts here, and it's not going to have a base flood elevation established for it. And that's the frustrating part, actually, of these zone A areas. So there are means to get that base flood elevation, and so, if you have a house that is built in this, this is where your elevation certificate would become really important, because that would establish what's the base flood elevation, and the community officials can help you with that. So your city emergency manager, floodplain manager, public works director, there's a lot of people wear a lot of different hats in communities. A county judge, a county emergency manager, so those can help you establish what that base flood elevation is if you have a house here in this zone A area. So it is still mapped, that insurance requirement is still required, but it makes it a little more challenging for your homeowners because that base flood might not be fully established with the water surface elevation yet.
Could I ask you one other question? The NFIP, it primarily requirements are concerning, am I right, that these would concern the FHA, VA, loans where?
Yes, it has to be a federally backed loan.
It has to be, I mean,
Yes.
that's where your requirements come in.
Yes.
Now, does the private, loan, mortgage industry get it all involved in following some of this, is
On
there
the
crossover?
private side, I think it's gonna be dependent on the insurer,
Mhm.
but I would imagine they lean towards that requirement.
Mhm.
If a house is paid off,
Yeah.
or they paid in cash, then there's not a requirement.
Right.
Yeah, but it is federally backed loan, which most of them are going to have some federal backing to it. So yeah, in particular, yeah, those like VA loans, things like that, those will absolutely trigger those requirements.
Okay,
to have
thanks.
it. Alright, so let's talk a little bit more about these areas. So your high-risk area, that 100-year floodplain, again, 1% chance of it flooding in any given year, but that compounds over a 30-year mortgage, so there's a 26% chance of flooding during like the 30-year life of a loan. Flood insurance is required for buildings with a federally backed mortgage. The floodplain regulations apply to anything in the blue area. So any new development, any new home, new building, it has to go through the permitting process with the community, so with the county, with the city, wherever it may be. If there's a floodway, again, this is the absolute highest risk area, don't like to do development in the floodway. But if you have to do development in the floodway or are part of the floodway, then you have to have an engineering study to show that there's no adverse impacts to that development. So more requirements, more work, but the same permitting process is gonna apply there. So you still have to go through your city or your county, and then the insurance is going to still be required for anywhere in this entire area. If there is something in this floodway, that's gonna be like the most restrictive location in terms of like local regulations. Out here, you're looking mostly at just doing a permit if it's a new building or a new home being built. In those moderate risk areas, so in that orange mapped area, the 500-year, flood insurance is not required in the orange. So, very strongly recommended though. Some lenders may require it, and that is going to be purely based on the lender itself. Out here, those floodplain regulations don't apply unless a community has adopted a higher standard, like the city of Houston, for example. Not every community, and I actually don't think, I'm not 100%, I don't know if there's any communities in Arkansas that have those higher standards where they fully regulate to the 500 year. But I will say, you know, even though flood insurance is not required for these areas, 32% of the NFIP claims over the last 10 years have been outside of the loop. And so these homes, while it's still a moderate risk, it's not no risk. And if you don't have flood insurance, you're out of pocket for all of those damages, even a federally declared disaster. There's only so much payment that you can still get out of that. So, any questions? So where do you get this? The best place to go, obviously, your lenders are gonna have all this information, but FEMA has two really great websites. The first is what's called their MAP Service Center, and this is actually a screenshot from the MAP Service Center, so you can look at a map, and then you can pull down to look at the act, like if you wanted to like print a map, you could look at that. There's a lot more products that you can look at on there through that MAP Service Center. And then also there's this National Flood Hazard Viewer, and that's actually where many of those other screenshots that I've pulled from of the firm, those come from that viewer. So it's an entire interface to where you can zoom around, zoom in, zoom out, look at all of the layers, and you can take print PDFs from that viewer itself, so that you can take like a snapshot. If you wanted to like zoom into here, you can take a snapshot of that area. It's going to show all of the special flood hazard area and all of those layers, cross sections, base flood elevations, all of that information will be on it. So, before we go to our part 3, any other questions at all? And you can always just, I know y'all are taking screenshots, which is awesome, but if you just do FEMA MAP Service Center, it'll get you what you need. Most city and county websites also have direct links to these on their websites. If a community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, someone on their staff should be designated as their floodplain administrator. And they go through training with the state. They have a requirement of so much training every year. And so they're gonna be the person you're gonna wanna talk to within a community. But I will say, especially in our smaller communities, they're probably wearing multiple hats. And so that floodplain administrator can be a mayor, it can be a county judge, it can be the water, maintenance supervisor, it can be an emergency manager. And so it's gonna be different people sometimes. And in some of these larger communities, there is like a dedicated stormwater floodplain administrator. So it's just gonna vary from community to community. Alright, still doing pretty good. Alright. So, the why. Why is all of this very important for you? In the past 5 years, 49% of all counties in the United States have experienced a flood. And I got this next statistic off FEMA's website this morning. I was really surprised by this. Over the last 20 years, what percent of counties across the U.S. do you think have experienced some type of flood event? 20 years, so longer term. Very close. It was 99% of counties.
Wow.
I was shocked by that. I will admit, I expected it would be closer to 85, 90. But that just really goes to show you that a flood can happen anywhere, and it can be something small, like some localized flash flooding is a flooding event. And so when you think of it especially in that long term, like, whew, that's a lot. So the why. Why are we here? Why is this all important to you? There's a lot of questions about the flood insurance industry right now. There's a lot of changes happening to it. But the big takeaway, this is something that we really got to stress, is that homeowner insurance doesn't cover floods. And that's like the If you take anything away, that's it. Flood insurance is not covered by a standard home insurance policy. Renter's insurance, not covered. If there's a condo association policy, it's not gonna cover personal property or building elements, if that unit's wholly owned by some type of unit owner. And so that's where that education component comes into play, because your clients need to know, hey, your building, your condo, you don't own it maybe. And so unless you wholly own it, you may need to look at these different policy options. What are the odds of disaster? So during a 30-year mortgage, 5 times more likely to experience a flood event than you are some other type of natural disaster or a fire. I think that one really hits home there hard, of like, that's a pretty significant difference. And then these are just kind of some facts from FEMA about flood insurance. You know, sewer backup coverage, you can get that added on, that helps. Again, floods aren't covered by your homeowner's policy. That flood insurance is gonna take effect after 30 days, so there is a 30-day grace period that they need to be aware of.
Is that just, FEMA's flood policy, or is that the same for private?
That's FEMA's policy, yeah. And then if your community participates in the NFIP, they can purchase through the National Flood Insurance Program. So if the community didn't participate, they could still buy a policy through a private insurer. It would be a separate type of policy.
How do we know as realtors that a community participates or not?
There's a website, but you can always check with me. Most communities in Arkansas participate. There are only a few counties that I know of that don't. But everywhere in Central Arkansas participates. So, but FEMA does have a list of all the participating communities, that you can access, but you can always, ask the community, ask someone with the city or county. This is a really good graphic, just talking about in 2024 in particular, what were the different types of disasters that we saw across the United States. The big one and the big reason that 8.8 billion happened in 2024 was Hurricane Helene. And again, that was an unfortunate situation where a lot of the structures damaged weren't in mapped areas. And so it just, it compounds. We see a lot more natural disasters, and damages just keep going up because property values are going up and costs are going up. And so those numbers aren't gonna get lower. This is just an overtime graph from 1980 to 2024 of billion-dollar events across the United States, and you can see here in that purple, 2023 was probably the largest number of billion-dollar events, with 2024 close behind it. Years that we have big hurricanes and big wildfires, those numbers are going to go up. Last year, 2025, we didn't have a very active hurricane season, and so, a little bit lower for 2025 on those billion-dollar disaster declarations. So, Arkansas. What about Arkansas? This is pulled from FEMA, and this is the dollar amount of claims paid by the NFIP over time. So you can see there, 217 million. It's quite a bit. Almost 8,000 number of claims have been paid in Arkansas with the NFIP program. So a lot of data. You can see kind of the darker blue spots. Those are going to be where the most of the claims have been filed. And I will say, again, there's some holes in some of this because you have houses that maybe were affected by a flood, but they didn't have flood insurance for whatever reason. And so you do see some spots where that a flood happened, but it may not be reported as damage or losses because those homeowners didn't have flood insurance, and so they're not making those flood insurance program claims. So the historical number of claims, you can kind of see here going up and down. Who remembers the 2011 flood? It was not a good one. 2011, that was really a peak for Arkansas with flood damages. That was a really significant flooding event. Everything came down the Mississippi. We had a lot of flooding in Arkansas, so we had a lot of water coming down the White, the Arkansas rivers, and then a lot of water backing up off the Mississippi. And so that was a big year for flood claims just due to the amount of snow melt and the amount of spring flooding that we had in 2011. And then this is the historical NFIP claims, the payments that have gone out across Arkansas since 1980. You can see here, again, 2011, big year. 2019, also big year. That was the year of the Arkansas River flood. So a lot of NFIP claims during that flooding event.
Do you think those numbers are increased because better education about flood insurance and claims compared to the 80s and 90s?
It could be. It absolutely could be. We've also, and value goes up. Everything's a lot more expensive, and that's a big part of it too. So that's going to go up with those costs. So I'm going to touch on elevation certificates. So elevation certificates are not always required. Sometimes they are, but they can be really helpful. An elevation certificate is used to document the first floor height of a structure and compare it to that base flood elevation, so that 100-year elevation. And you can use this, a homeowner can use this to assess what their flood risk is. Is their home half a foot above that base flood elevation? Is it lower than it? So you can document all of those elevations and document that for the homeowner. You do have to have a licensed surveyor or engineer complete that elevation certificate, so it does have to be stamped and sealed. When you get one, it's recommended that you submit that to your community so that the city has it on file, the county has it on file, and then if a home changes owners, the city still has it documented. So that elevation certificate doesn't change unless they've made a substantial improvement to the property. So unless something has changed at the property, that elevation certificate is going to carry over if the home ownership changes. There is a potential with that elevation certificate, you can lower your home insurance. It is not a guarantee, and it is very dependent on your lender. But you can see here, these are just some rough estimates, like nationwide discounts that FEMA estimates. If your home is 4 feet above that base flood, you might receive up to 28% discount on your flood insurance premium. And so if your structure is a foot above, you're gonna see some reduction, not that much, but you'll have a little bit of reduction in that premium cost. So if you have a basement, that's not gonna be considered. So if your basement is lower than that base flood elevation, that's not going to get counted as like your first floor elevation. So it's a separate part of that elevation certificate. They are looking at the actual first floor livable space on a structure. And again, most of the time, you're not gonna need one of these, and they're not going to be required, and so it really is, it's a recommendation if there's not already been one on the file, and it can be a helpful item to have, but not a requirement. Some more flood insurance, so this is a little bit outdated, but it's still a good graphic. I really like to show it, especially because it has this water level on here. So your premium at 4 foot below the base flood elevation, so that's the base flood elevation, and that house was built maybe at a time when there weren't as stricter regulations, or maybe it got mapped in, whatever the case may be. It's below that base flood elevation, so you're going to have the highest premiums there because you're lower than that risk, what that water surface elevation is. If you are at that base flood elevation, then you're still going to have a premium, but it's going to be kind of more of that standard, here's your risk, here's where you're at. Once you start building up, that's going to be where you start to see those reductions in that insurance premium. Any questions?
Natalie,
Yes.
where would one go to find if there's an elevation certificate already in the property?
The city or the city, the community you're at, their city offices should have those on file. Once one has been submitted to them, they are supposed to keep them on file. That's part of their requirements as being a community, so they should have it. I know like the city of Jonesboro, they actually keep an online list of all of the elevation certificates that they have processed. So not every community has that, but they should have them on file. So, this is a screen, this is a picture from Arkansas River flooding of 2019. And with that flood, the average FEMA insurance payment was $75,000. So those folks who made those claims. But what I really wanted you to see here, the average amount that non-insured owners received was only $9,200. And so that really hits home of like where flood insurance is gonna be really helpful, because even with a federally declared disaster, there's a top to how much you get paid out with a declared disaster. And it is significantly lower than what your insurance claim may be, so. And I do wanna say this, on kind of this last kind of point about, with the claims. There are a lot of changes to the flood insurance program, and there's a lot of changes and there's a lot of unknowns, but we know in the industry that, disaster declarations are changing. And so the value of disaster to declare it, to actually be a declared disaster is changing. What that's going to be, we don't know, but they're changing what those constraints are to actually qualify for a federally declared disaster. And so that may impact homeowners down the road if they say, well, it has to be, you know, this level of disaster, $1 billion of damage to be a federally declared disaster versus maybe it was 500 million previously. So those thresholds are changing. We don't know what they're going to be, but you know, if a homeowner is able to and can get that flood insurance, that's where it's really going to be important, because they may change that threshold and the disaster might not be declared, and then they're 100% out of pocket or working with their insurance company to try to get some type of payment back. So a few important points here. Flood insurance is undergoing a lot of change. That's just the way the industry is going. So there's a lot of unknowns of what it's going to look like in the future. And with the National Flood Insurance Program, they had recommended some change a few years ago to how the program rated homes, and there was enough pushback that they took a step back and said, all right, we're not going to push this change through. So they're reevaluating it. So they're looking at some changes long term for how to make that program more sustainable. You know, we're trying to stay on top of that as best we can. Flood insurance is always recommended regardless of your zone. And just kind of another point, you know, a lender might require flood insurance and they may require elevation information from anyone. So you could be just outside that mapped area and they still might require it. It's really going to be dependent on your insurance provider. This 30-day waiting period is pretty important there. If you get flood insurance through that National Flood Insurance Program, there is a 30-day waiting period for that to go into effect and go fully effective. If you have a policy with a subsidized rate, that will transfer to the new homeowner as long as there's not a lapse of coverage. So if the new homeowner comes in and immediately gets their sign up and there's not any break in that coverage, so it qualifies, transfers over. So that new homeowner would still get that same reduction. But kind of the key takeaway for you is, you know, do that research yourself. Make sure that you're up to date on where your homes are located in that floodplain so that you can educate and you can talk to your clients about it as well. So a couple of just like flood insurance resources. This FEMA Flood Smart is a great website. It is part of FEMA's website, but it's kind of like a separate site. It's floodsmart.gov, and that is where you can get all the information you wanted to know about flood insurance. It has some great handouts as well, some just like quick facts that you can pull, and it makes it really easy to walk through that flood insurance process. This last slide, so these are just some of the websites that you might find helpful. Again, the MAP Service Center, that is like the place to go check. If you are not sure about a house, you can go look it up on the MAP Service Center, or the National Flood Hazard Viewer. I do like to link to this base flood elevation viewer. It is helpful for your areas that are mapped as Zone A, those approximate study areas. And then lastly, the Arkansas Natural Resources Division, they're under the Department of Agriculture. They are the state NFIP coordinator. So the NFIP runs through Arkansas Natural Resources. And so I've got their contact information, but they are, their website has some great information for homeowners, for community officials, that you may find useful as well. So, I will leave you with, again, I'm Natalie Rogers. That is my contact information with the Arkansas Floodplain Management Association. And then I've also got contacts here for Whit Montague and Aaron Miller with Arkansas Natural Resources, so they're with the state. Whit is the supervisor for dam safety and floodplain management, and Aaron Miller is our state NFIP coordinator. And so if you ever have a question, you know, give them a call. I will say they're pretty busy. They might not call you back immediately, but, you know, give them a call, shoot them an email. They are always happy to help you answer questions. And they'll also put you in contact if you're not sure who to call in a city or a county. They can get you in contact with the appropriate person in your community as well. So, and that is what I've got. I think we're right on time. So, any questions?
You had a question?
Yeah.
From you already said this, how often are those maps updated?
I don't have a good answer for that, unfortunately. It varies.
Sometimes on properties you have like on papers documentation that has been removed from the AE zone, but the maps are still not showing.
Right.
So what is that?
So you're talking about like a letter of map amendment. So when those, that is documentation from FEMA that can be submitted and processed that shows that house, that property has been removed from a floodplain because of fill, because it's on stilts, it was mapped inadvertently with old mapping, but it doesn't actually change the map. So those are normally, basically, if you look, I don't have a good example, I'm sorry. If you looked at a firm map on like the digital viewer, it would just show a dot at that property location and would show that it had a letter of amendment completed for that. But it doesn't actually like physically change the map. The same thing can be done with the letter of map revision. Those are like bigger areas that get restudied. They don't physically change the paper official firm map until they do like an entire countywide study. So there's documentation of it. You can go look at that changed revised area, but like if you just looked at the map panel, it would not be changed until they do a whole new countywide study. So you may have a county that has amendments, those revision areas, for many years before they go in and get it all reincorporated. Washington County is a really good example of that. Their county-wide study that went effective finally late 24, early 25, it probably took 6 to 7 years to get all that through, just because there was so much to incorporate. And when they do those, they make sure to compare any filed documentation. If like there's a change in water surface elevation, they try to check it against any of those like amendments that have been filed. So, and they'll reevaluate all of those. Maumell's a really good example of that, where a lot of amendments have been filed when they redid the map. They basically reissued those amendments, so for those structures. So.
What's the process for an amendment?
And so for the amendment, it is an application that you submit to FEMA. If it's based on like natural grade, it is a free application submitted to FEMA, and you need documentation of what the firm map is at that property location, and then you need to show, the elevations of the property, the plat, as-built, any kinds like documentation like that goes to support the amendment. So, if there's been fill placed on the property, which is pretty common, then you do definitely need that survey to come in and show that fill's been placed here, and there is a small fee associated with it if there's been fill placed.
Natural grade.
But if it's natural grade, that's a free submittal, so. Or if it's on stilts or something like that, that's fully open, enough open underneath, that's also qualifies under that free application. So.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming to our PD Power Hour. Our next one, these are always on the second Wednesday of the month, so our next one will be June 10th. We're still finalizing who our speaker is. We've got a few that we're juggling, so we want to put the puzzle together in a way that will work the best, but I promise it's going to be fantastic, whatever we land on. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Natalie. You know how to get a hold of her. If you need some more information, feel free to reach out to her. I think she'll be happy to help. A lot of good information today. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.